Hey everyone, Nigel here. If you tuned into our video earlier this week, then you'll know that for our last compilation series to round out the holiday season, we decided to try a new approach to how we handle cold cases. Instead of choosing just a couple to dig into at the end of the year, we're bringing you all of the cold case related news that we covered in 2024. This is the second and final part of the compilation. If you missed the first and want to see that, there's a link in the description below. As always, keep in mind that because this is a compilation video, these segments have not been edited since they appeared in their respective lists, so more details might have been released about these stories since we first covered them. Also, a heads up, we'll be back next week with all new editions of Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International, so be sure to check those out as well. With that out of the way, this is part 2 of Cold Cases Solved in 2024. Representatives from Georgia's DeKalb County Sheriff's Office released a major update in a more than 30-year-old cold case double murder this week, announcing that after all this time they had finally arrested and charged a suspect in connection with the awful crime. The case began all the way back on July 15, 1990, when DeKalb County Police received a horrifying early morning phone call from 43-year-old Pamela Sumter. Pamela said that she had been the victim of a brutal and violent attack inside of her apartment. She had managed to get away and call for help at a neighbor's unit, but she was pretty sure that her brother was dead. Officers arrived at the residence, located on Tree Hills Parkway in the community of Redan, just after 4:30 a.m. that morning. Pamela was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, while her brother, 46-year-old John Sumter, was pronounced dead at the scene. He was found lying on the floor of the apartment that they both shared. Police interviewed Pamela while she was in the hospital, who was able to provide them with some crucial information. She said that earlier that day, John had been showing an acquaintance around who had just moved to the Atlanta area from Michigan. Pamela explained that the pair had returned to their apartment that night and that she had gone to bed around 11:30 p.m. The next thing she remembered was being awoken to the horrifying attack, during which she was stabbed and raped. Unfortunately, Pamela only knew the young man who had been with her brother that day by a nickname. She gave police a description, and a rape kit was collected. However, tragedy struck again just weeks later on August 5th, when Pamela also passed away from her injuries. With her death, police lost their only witness. They continued to try and push forward with the investigation, but sadly, the case eventually went cold. It wasn't until 2022 when authorities finally got their next big break. It came when the Georgia Bureau of Investigation sent off a bunch of pre-1999 rape kits for DNA analysis that had never been properly tested. In Pamela's case, this was because the CODIS database was in its infancy back in 1990. The national database still wouldn't be formulated for 4 more years and wouldn't become fully operational until 1998. When the DNA was tested in 2022, it came back as a match to a 1992 sexual assault case out of Detroit. That case had never been prosecuted, though through further investigation, detectives were able to uncover the name of a suspect, Kenneth Perry. It turned out that Perry, now in his 50s, lived just 1 county away from where the 1990 double murder took place, in Loganville. From here, investigators worked with genetic genealogy company Othram Inc. to develop a profile and see if they could properly link the 1992 case with the man who they found in Loganville. This was eventually successful, and on June 6th of this year, they finally had enough evidence to make an arrest. Once Perry was in custody, police secured a warrant to directly test his DNA against Pamela Sumter's rape kit. It also came back as a match. On June 25th, Kenneth Perry was indicted on 2 counts each of malice murder, felony murder, aggravated battery, and possession of a knife during the commission of a felony. He also faces 4 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of theft by taking. A Hawaii cold case murder that was already filled with awful twists and turns took yet another unexpected detour this week, when authorities announced that they had finally identified a suspect, only for the man to take his own life just days later. The whole thing began all the way back on Christmas Eve of 1991, when Dana Ireland was found under harrowing conditions in Puna district on Hawaii's Big Island. The 23-year-old Virginia woman had been visiting the island on vacation, but had disappeared while taking a bike ride earlier that day. Dana was discovered in a wooded area along a remote fishing trail. She was barely clinging to life, was partially clothed, and had been horrifically beaten and raped. Her mangled bicycle was found at the side of a road several miles away from where she was found. Though Dana was rushed to a hospital in the nearby city of Hilo, sadly, she died from her injuries the following day. From the very beginning, it seems that the investigation into Dana's murder was a complete mess. The initial investigation went cold early on, and it wasn't until several years in that the first real suspects were identified. It came when a man named Frank Pauline Jr. claimed to know what had happened. While Frank initially claimed to be a witness, he ended up changing his story numerous times, giving inconsistent details. Eventually, he incriminated himself along with two other men, a pair of brothers named Ian and Sean Schweitzer. In retrospect, it should have been obvious to police that Frank's shifting stories meant that he was not a reliable witness. However, even after the case was initially dismissed due to evidence showing that the Schweitzers were likely not involved, authorities pursued them anyway. In the year 2000, Frank and Ian were convicted of murder and given life in prison. Though all three men maintained their innocence, after seeing the two convictions, Sean opted to take a plea deal, pleading guilty to manslaughter. As a result, he received only a year in prison plus 5 years of probation. Well, I say only a year in prison, but he was convicted of a crime he didn't commit. Still, that looks positively lenient compared to what happened to his brother and Frank. Frank died in 2015 while still serving his sentence, while Ian was finally released in 2023. That release came after the Hawaii Innocence Project took Ian and Sean's case and appealed for the case to be re-examined. Sure enough, when the situation was looked at, it did not add up and both of the Schweitzers' convictions were overturned. Unbelievably, it was only at this point that authorities seemingly began to re-examine the evidence in the case. Specifically, DNA that was found on Dana's body, a sheet used to take her to the hospital, and a blood-soaked t-shirt at the scene. The blood belonged to Dana, but several bits of DNA belonged to an unknown male, someone who was not Frank Pauline or either of the Schweitzer brothers. With this new information, authorities used genetic genealogy to begin searching for this unknown man. It led them to a 57-year-old named Albert Loro Jr., who lived just 2 miles from where Dana's body had been found back in 1991. After obtaining Loro's DNA from a discarded fork, police compared it against evidence from the 1991 crime scene. It was a match, allowing authorities to obtain a warrant for his DNA directly. That swab was taken on July 19th at Loro's home. It would also later turn out to be a match. However, before investigators could move forward with an arrest, Loro reportedly took his own life. He was found dead at his house on July 23rd, with the news being released to the public this week. The announcement prompted outrage from the Schweitzer families and their legal team, who accused police of intentionally botching the investigation into Albert Loro. Specifically, they argue that they knew the risks of not taking the 57-year-old into custody when they had the chance, and that this likely came at the expense of ever figuring out what had truly happened to Dana Ireland. For their part, police say that these accusations are totally false and claim that there was a good reason why they waited on an arrest. They say that while the DNA match was enough to link Loro to Dana's rape, it wasn't enough to prove that he had murdered her. Since the statute of limitations had expired on any sexual assault charges, they feared that bringing him in prematurely would cause all of the evidence to be thrown out by a court. Right now, it appears that the whole situation is just a mess of finger-pointing and wasted opportunities, though it appears to be seen where the case will go from here. Police say that they are still determined to try and solve Dana's murder and are hoping that Loro's cell phone records, as well as interviews with his family and friends, will provide the answers they are looking for. Meanwhile, the Schweitzer brothers and their legal team are demanding a federal investigation into the police handling of the case, specifically regarding why Loro wasn't arrested at the time his DNA was taken. Speaking on the brothers' behalf, the co-director of the Hawaii Innocence Project, Kenneth Lawson, said that the Schweitzers are, quote, happy that this person was finally caught, but that they're disappointed in the way that it happened. The situation is still developing. Representatives from Georgia's Atlanta Police Department made a massive announcement in a more than 25-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that after all this time, they had successfully made an arrest in the case. According to reports, 21-year-old Melissa Wolfenbarger's family last heard from her on Thanksgiving of 1998. She spoke with her mother, Norma Patton, over the phone while she was with her husband, Christopher, at his grandparents' house with their 2 kids. The conversation was normal enough. It ended with Norma offering to pick Melissa up if she wanted and telling her that she loved her. Little did she know, that was the final conversation that they would ever have. Though Norma and other family members were worried when they were unable to reach Melissa after that, they weren't all that surprised. For the last few years, Melissa's home life had been very turbulent. Her husband, Christopher, was abusive and tried to keep Melissa and the kids away from them. She'd actually briefly left Christopher earlier in 1998, but by the time of her disappearance had gone back to live with him. Still, by early 2000, Melissa's family members were worried enough that they reported her missing to authorities where she lived in Atlanta. When police began investigating, they understandably focused on Christopher, especially since he had never reported anything about Melissa's disappearance. During interviews, though, Christopher claimed that he didn't know where his wife was. He said that she had left again, and that the last time they had been in contact was shortly after Thanksgiving, in December of 1998. He said that he might have seen her walking down the street near their home a few months later, but he couldn't be sure. It wasn't until 2003 that any real progress was made in the case. Sadly, the update was also the worst news possible. It turned out that Melissa was dead, and actually had been for some time. On April 29, 1999, a person who was walking in an area about a mile from Melissa's home found a trash bag at the side of the road. Inside was a human skull. 2 months later, additional remains were found scattered in the surrounding area. Because of the advanced state of decomposition, the remains were initially misidentified as belonging to a man. However, in 2003, Melissa's family learned about the discovery of the unidentified body parts. They had been sitting in a local morgue for 4 years. They put 2 and 2 together, contacted police, and provided DNA samples. Testing officially determined that these were Melissa's remains. That same year, the case took kind of a wild turn, because Melissa's father, Carl Patton, was arrested for a series of 5 killings that had taken place in the 1970s. These killings were referred to as the Flint River Murders, and Carl was sentenced to life in prison for them right around the time his daughter was officially identified. Understandably, this was an avenue of investigation in relation to Melissa's case as well, though Carl was ruled out as a suspect. Both police and family members were convinced that he had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance and murder. In fact, according to some sources, he helped alert police to the fact that she was missing in the first place. With that, the case went cold. Despite more than 2 decades passing, Melissa's family never gave up the fight for justice. It seems their patience has finally paid off, because this week it was announced that an arrest had been made. In what will likely come as no surprise, the person arrested was Christopher Wolfenbarger. So far, authorities have not released really any information about what caused this massive shift in the investigation after all these years. However, they did say that Christopher had been arrested for the murder on August 6th. At the time, he was found hiding behind a dryer in his home. Melissa's mother and her sister Tina told the media this week that they had always suspected Christopher was responsible. Tina stated in part, quote, "From day one, we knew it was Christopher. There was never any doubt in my mind." She described Melissa as an all too familiar victim of domestic violence, saying, quote, "She loved her kids. There's no way she would have left her kids. That's why she kept going back to him." At the time of this recording, Christopher Wolfenbarger remains in custody on 1 count of murder. Representatives from Texas's Austin Police Department released a massive update in a more than 44-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that they have now successfully identified and arrested one of the alleged perpetrators behind the heinous crime. The whole thing began all the way back on the night of January 9th, 1980, when 25-year-old Susan Lee Wolf left her home and headed to a friend's place. It was about 10 p.m., and Susan's residence was being sprayed for bugs, so she was planning to stay there for the night. Sadly, she would never arrive. The following day, a person inspecting a local rental property made a horrifying discovery. Next to the building, they found Susan's partially clothed body lying in an alleyway. An autopsy would later determine that she had been strangled with a ligature, shot in the head, and sexually assaulted. Adding further tragedy to the situation, Susan had been killed the same day that she had decided to make a big change in her life and had enrolled as a nursing student at the University of Texas at Austin. Thanks to a witness in the case, police were quickly able to figure out that Susan had likely been the victim of an abduction. This person saw the 25-year-old being grabbed as she was walking down Franklin Street that night. According to the witness, a car had stopped and the driver got out, putting Susan in a bear hug and covering her head with a coat before forcing her inside. The passenger door had also opened during the abduction, though it wasn't clear who was in the vehicle or how they were involved. The witness identified the car used in the crime as a 1970 Dodge Polara. Using this information, police looked into 40 people of interest during the first year of the investigation. This list was narrowed to 6 suspects, though unfortunately it was at this point that the case went cold. In the spring of 2023, a new team of investigators reopened the case and began testing DNA evidence related to the sexual assault. Unfortunately, all 6 of the original suspects in the case were ruled out. However, not long after this, the team was able to identify another possible suspect, a now 78-year-old man named Deck Brewer Jr. Brewer was easy to find since he was already in prison in Massachusetts on unrelated charges. Police learned that he had been in the Austin and San Antonio areas around the time of Susan's murder and were able to obtain a DNA sample from him this past June. The results allegedly showed that Brewer was a match to evidence from the 1980 cold case. On August 14th, an arrest warrant was issued for the 78-year-old, and he has now been charged with murder. Police say that he will be extradited to Texas once he completes his sentence in Massachusetts at the end of this month. Sadly, Susan's parents did not live long enough to see this development in the case after so many years. However, her younger brother Charles says that he is overjoyed by the update. He told reporters in an interview last week, quote, "I know that there is a higher power at work, and I think that we're on the road to finally seeing some justice for her homicide." As for the second suspect believed to be involved in the murder, no new information has been released. However, police say that they are now working to solve this part of the mystery as well. Representatives from Arkansas's Van Buren County Sheriff's Office released a major update in the more than 44-year-old cold case killing of a Washington woman this week, announcing that after all this time they had finally made an arrest in connection with her rape and murder. The case began all the way back on February 26, 1980, when police in the city of Kent, Washington, received a call from the worried family members of 44-year-old Dorothy Dottie Silzel. The family members explained that no one had been able to get a hold of her, and she had now missed 2 days in a row at her job as an instructor for the Boeing Aircraft Company. The last time anyone had seen Dottie was on February 23rd, when she left her other job at a local pizza place. She lived alone, so the concerned loved ones asked if police would conduct a welfare check. When officers went inside Dottie's condo, they were greeted by an awful scene. The 44-year-old was found dead inside. She had marks on her neck, and a robe was draped over her arm. An autopsy would later reveal she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, but that she had died from strangulation. Semen was found both on her body and on the robe. Though the murder was investigated at the time, sadly, the case soon went cold. The semen evidence was tested in 2002 and eventually added into the CODIS system. However, no matches were returned. It wasn't until a full 20 years later, in 2022, that new advancements in forensics made it possible to uncover new leads from this same evidence. As with many of these stories, the answer came with genetic genealogy. The samples were handed over to a company called Identifinders International, who managed to narrow down the suspects to a pair of brothers by the last name of Kundert. When the brothers were tracked down in the fall of 2023, one of them allowed his DNA to be tested and was eliminated. The other man, 65-year-old Kenneth Kundert, refused to cooperate with police in any way. Finally, in March of this year, police got the break that they were hoping for. After placing Kenneth Kundert under surveillance, they watched as he smoked and discarded a cigarette butt outside of a Walmart store near his home in Van Buren County, Arkansas. That cigarette butt was subsequently tested and came back as a match to evidence at the Dottie Silzel crime scene. This week, investigators announced that Kundert had been arrested and that he is now awaiting extradition to Washington, where he will face first-degree murder charges. In an interview with local media, Dottie's niece spoke about the roller coaster of emotion she experienced after learning about the update. She said in part, quote, "First it was outrage, then it was overwhelming joy that we got some closure. Hopefully we can convict this guy of doing what he did. He's a mon." Representatives from Florida's Manatee County Sheriff's Office released a major update in a more than 27-year-old cold case murder this week, announcing that after nearly 3 decades, they had finally been able to make an arrest in connection with the case. The whole thing began all the way back on December 15th, 1996, when police were called about an awful discovery in a drainage canal on US Route 41 North in the city of Palmetto. A woman's body had been found lying face down in the water. When officers went to investigate, they discovered that the woman was dead and that she had obviously been the victim of a brutal attack. There was no water in her lungs, so she hadn't drowned, and there was no sign of a sexual assault. However, an autopsy found that she had been stabbed a shocking 83 times. It would take roughly 7 months before the victim was identified as a 45-year-old woman named Doris Carell. Doris was a housekeeper who lived in the city of St. Petersburg with her boyfriend, Stephen Ford. Police there had been looking for her after she had seemingly vanished without a trace. Doris had been reported missing on December 11th, just a few days before her body was found. That report had been made by her pregnant daughter, who became worried about the soon-to-be grandmother after she received a call from Ford asking her if she had seen her. Doris's abandoned red Mazda RX-7 was found in the parking lot of the Pinellas Square Mall on December 18th. However, there was no sign of a struggle. In fact, there was no evidence at all inside, leading investigators to believe that the vehicle had been wiped down. Unsurprisingly, authorities quickly turned their attention to Ford, who was the last person to see Doris alive. He claimed that he had nothing to do with the crime and stated that she had left their home the night after an argument they had on December 8th, telling him that she was going shopping. He said that she never returned. Police didn't buy Ford's story, and their suspicions about him only grew with his increasingly bizarre behavior over the next little while. He rented a storage unit and placed all of Doris's valuables and other belongings inside, stating that he didn't want her daughter to have them. He also opened Christmas presents that had been wrapped under their tree days before the holiday, as if he knew Doris was never coming home. On December 24th, 1996, authorities went to speak to Ford again at he and Doris's home, only for no one to answer at the door. When officers forced their way inside, they found Ford foaming at the mouth and only partially conscious. He had drank bleach in an apparent suicide attempt. He was able to be saved, though even after this, he refused to admit any wrongdoing. In fact, when asked what should happen to him if Doris ended up being dead, he replied, quote, "An eye for an eye. If I killed her, I should get the death penalty." Even after Doris's body was found and identified, unfortunately, police felt that they didn't have enough evidence against Ford. As a result, the case eventually went cold. It would stay that way until 2017, when a new team took on the investigation. 7 years later, that team says that they now believe they have uncovered enough new evidence against Ford. It's not clear exactly what this evidence is, though they have mentioned that friends of Doris's told them that she feared Ford at the time of her murder and that they were experiencing financial and domestic problems. On August 16th, police arrested the now 72-year-old Ford at his home in Georgetown, Delaware. He apparently told authorities afterwards, quote, "My past has come up to haunt me." He has since been extradited to Florida, and his next court hearing is scheduled for mid-October. Authorities in Prince William County, Virginia say that the prime suspect in a more than 14-year-old cold case murder is successfully in custody after he was busted last week during a routine traffic stop in Florida. The stop took place on September 17th when Flagler County deputies reportedly witnessed a pickup truck blow through a red light on Old Kings Road. When they pulled over the driver, later identified as 43-year-old Timothy Sean Hickerson, they told him that he wouldn't just be getting a ticket. Body cam footage, which partially captured the interaction, shows Hickerson looking shocked as he is informed that he is also being arrested on outstanding warrants for burglary and second-degree murder. Those two charges are in connection with the more than 14-year-old cold case killing of 23-year-old Shane Donahue. Shane was last seen all the way back on March 22, 2010, when he was leaving his parents' house in the community of Nokesville, Virginia. He was supposed to be on his way to his own home nearby. However, he never arrived. He was reported missing 2 days later after no one was able to get in contact with him. While Shane's body has never been found, he has long since been presumed dead by police. The case was investigated back when it initially happened, though it soon went cold. It wasn't until spring of this year, when a new team of investigators began re-examining the case, that a breakthrough was finally made. That breakthrough reportedly pointed to Timothy Hickerson. While the exact details and evidence that police uncovered has not been released, authorities say that at the time of Shane's disappearance, Hickerson was an acquaintance of his. Shane had just come into a sizable amount of money for a construction job that he had done, and it's alleged that Hickerson was involved in a burglary at his home just a few days before he vanished. Not only that, but witnesses allegedly saw Hickerson and Shane together when he left his parents' house on March 22, 2010. Hickerson, who was 28 at the time, was later convicted of 2 burglaries at Northern Virginia gun stores and served 4 years in federal prison. He later moved to Florida, where he was arrested this week. At the time of this recording, Hickerson remains in custody on that murder and burglary warrant, but is attempting to fight his extradition to Virginia. The situation is still developing. Hopefully you all like solved cold cases, because we've got another one to share with you as the last story this week. Representatives from Wisconsin's La Crosse and Vernon County Sheriff's Offices released a massive update in a nearly 40-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that after all this time, they had finally made an arrest in connection with the brutal killing. The case began all the way back on February 14, 1985, when police received a call from a man named Russell Lee. Russell explained that his fiancée, 24-year-old Terry Delawy, had taken her dog out for a walk that morning and that she had never returned. When an investigation was launched, it quickly became clear that Terry had not disappeared of her own accord. Her car, purse, and all of her other personal belongings were still at the house where she and Russell lived in the community of Barre Mills. Terry also had a lot going for her. The 24-year-old was a senior at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, where she was studying finance. She also had a good job as a bar manager at a local upscale restaurant. 4 days into the search for Terry, authorities received a gut-wrenching update when they learned about a chilling discovery that had been made in neighboring Vernon County. The remains of a woman's body had been found in a roadside culvert. The victim's head had been removed, and the body had been burned with an accelerant. These were later determined to be the remains of Terry Delawy. Neither her head nor her dog were ever recovered. Police later followed up on a couple of major clues. Terry's body had been wrapped in a sheet, one which contained a paint chip that looked like it had come from a repainted vehicle. Authorities theorized that this had come from the trunk of the car Terry had been transported in after her murder. Semen was also found with the remains. However, when DNA analysis eventually became possible and was performed, there was no match in the database. As a result, the investigation went cold. It wasn't until 2023, when the case was re-examined by a new team of investigators, that police turned their attention towards a specific suspect. That suspect was Michael Raymond Popp. Back in 1985, Popp was a truck driver who lived close to Terry and Russell. Not only that, but Popp and his girlfriend often hung out with the couple and would participate in pool tournaments together. In early 2023, DNA was collected from Popp and compared to evidence from the 1985 crime scene. It reportedly came back as a match. When Popp was initially questioned about the murder, he claimed that Terry was a casual acquaintance. However, when confronted with this new evidence, he allegedly changed his story, stating that he, quote, maybe had a little affair for 6 to 8 months. He said he lied because, quote, well, it's a pretty serious case there. Didn't want to be associated with it. Investigators didn't buy Popp's excuse, and this week the now 60-year-old was charged with first-degree murder. At the time of this recording, he remains in custody. Representatives from the Boston Police Department released a massive update in a more than 30-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that they had arrested a suspect thanks to new DNA evidence that had been collected in quite the interesting way. The case began all the way back on the morning of May 27, 1988, when the mother of 25-year-old Karen Taylor called her at her apartment in Boston's Roxbury neighborhood. The woman was expecting her daughter to pick up. However, she was surprised when instead her 3-year-old granddaughter answered the phone. What the child said next was extremely alarming. She explained that her mom was sleeping and that she couldn't wake her up. Karen's mom raced over to her apartment on William Street. However, when she arrived, she wasn't able to get inside. She walked around the building until she found that the window to Karen's first-floor bedroom was unlocked. When she crawled inside, she made an awful discovery. Karen was lying face down in a pool of her own blood. She had been stabbed in the chest, neck, and head at least 15 times. When police began investigating the murder, they discovered a number of items of interest at the crime scene. Among these were a bloody sweatshirt, a cigarette, and a check. That check was made out to a man named James Holloman. Despite this lead, Holloman denied any involvement in the crime and said he hadn't seen Karen for weeks before the murder. Because there was no forensic evidence linking Holloman to the killing, investigators moved on and the case eventually went cold. The case stayed that way until 2023, when new testing was done on evidence found at the 1988 crime scene, particularly on DNA that had been recovered underneath Karen's fingernails. This was compared to DNA from Holloman, whose sample was collected by officers after they observed him spitting on a sidewalk outside his home. When the samples were compared, Holloman's DNA was determined to be a match. The now 65-year-old was arrested on September 19th after a warrant was put out for him on murder charges. Currently, many details have not been shared with the public, including the relationship between Karen and Holloman and the alleged motive behind the crime. However, police say that they are happy to have finally made a breakthrough after so many years. Representatives from Idaho's Ada County Sheriff's Office released a major update in a more than 44-year-old cold case investigation last week, announcing that after all of this time, they had finally solved the brutal murder of a local woman. The case began all the way back on June 26, 1980, when a crew of road workers found the body of a woman in an irrigation ditch along Highway 55, just north of the Boise suburb of Eagle. The woman had sustained 11 stab wounds to the left side of her body, including injuries to her neck and chest. There were further blunt force wounds to the back of her head, as well as defensive injuries that indicated she had fought hard against her attacker. The victim was quickly identified as Mary Tracy, a 24-year-old mother of 2 who was from the local area. At the time, Mary was living just outside of Boise in Garden City and had last been seen 2 days before her body was discovered. That was when she had left her 2 daughters with a friend at the local Sunliner Motel following an argument with her husband. Naturally, Mary's husband was the first suspect to be considered, as police found out that they were going through a period of marital and financial stress. However, he was ruled out after it was determined he was in the hospital at the time of the murder. While speaking to witnesses, investigators learned that there were rumors that someone had been killed at the Sunliner Motel. A maid even claimed that she had found blood in one of the rooms there. This was interesting not only because Mary was staying at the motel, but because based on her autopsy, police concluded that she had been killed somewhere else before being moved to where her body was found. However, the business denied that any crime had taken place there, and without any substantial evidence, police came up short. With that, the case went cold. Things would stay that way until August of 2023, when the investigation was reopened at the request of Mary's daughters. When it was, one suspect stood out, a man named Charles Nicholas Strain. Strain had a disturbing criminal history, one that spanned many years and multiple states across the Pacific Northwest. In 1981, he kidnapped his 10-year-old daughter, who he did not have custody of, and fled to Arizona, where he remained for over 2 years. In 1986, he was charged and convicted in the murder of his 16-year-old stepdaughter, Deanna Dean, who died of a gunshot wound to the head. The teen had been missing for 5 years before Strain was finally caught. Not only was Strain living in the Garden City area around the time of Mary Tracy's murder, but according to police, previous interviews with a jailhouse informant had connected him to the case. The informant claimed that Strain had confessed to killing a woman around the same time that Mary was murdered. Specifically, Strain allegedly told him, quote, "I just killed a girl, and I threw her over a ditch." Unfortunately, by the time the new investigative team learned of this information in 2023, the informant had been dead for 30 years, so it wasn't possible to re-interview him. However, they were able to test DNA from some of Strain's prior crimes against evidence from the 1980 Mary Tracy murder. This included a strange scrap of newspaper that had been found stuck to Mary's head at the time her body was discovered, which turned out to have been printed more than 10 years earlier. Eerily, the newspaper apparently contained an article about Richard Speck, the notorious killer convicted of murdering 8 nursing students in a single night. In June of this year, testing revealed that Strain's DNA matched evidence in the Mary Tracy case, indicating that he was almost certainly the person responsible for her murder. Unfortunately, Strain cannot be charged in connection with the case, though, as he died in prison in 2007 while serving his sentence for the murder of his stepdaughter. During their announcement last week, police stated that they now consider Mary's case closed, though they are still hoping to tie up a couple of loose ends. In particular, they say that they want to speak to anyone who worked at the Sunliner Motel during the summer of 1980. They are also attempting to track down a friend of Mary's named Lisa, who may have been one of the last people to see her alive. Anyone with information about the case is encouraged to reach out to the Ada County Sheriff's Office. Authorities in Volusia County, Florida released a massive update in a more than 40-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that not only had they successfully identified the Jane Doe victim, but that they also believe they know the person responsible for her death. The case began all the way back on November 5th, 1980, when a crew of road workers made an awful discovery while on the job just north of the city of Port Orange. While working on a section of Interstate 95, they found the heavily decomposed remains of a human body that had been dumped in the median. While investigators did the best they could at the time to solve the murder, due to the state of the remains, they weren't able to get very far. They determined that the victim was a young woman around the age of 30, however, they were unable to identify her. Instead, she became known as Jane Doe 1980. It would take more than 4 decades, until 2023, before progress was finally made. That's when Volusia County investigators reached out to FHD Forensics and were able to secure the proper funding for modern genealogical DNA testing through a nonprofit called Genealogy for Justice. Through months of painstaking work, experts were finally able to give Jane Doe 1980 back her name. That name is Pamela K. Whitman. After looking for surviving relatives, authorities were able to get in contact with Pamela's younger half-sister, who confirmed that she hadn't seen her since before 1980. For years, she had wondered what had happened to her. She'd known that Pamela was in Florida for some amount of time, but her whereabouts from there had been unclear. Though it wasn't the news that Pamela's family had hoped for, police were able to give them further closure as well. They say that they believe the then 25-year-old was the victim of a notorious serial killer named Gerald Stano. Stano was known to operate in the Daytona Beach area around the time of Pamela's murder, and later confessed to the killings of several women and girls. In fact, police say that Stano admitted to the murder of Jane Doe 1980 at one point, though back then no one knew her identity. His MO also matches how it's believed Pamela would have disappeared. He looked for young women walking alone who he perceived as vulnerable. It's believed that he killed her in February of 1980, several months before her remains were found. Stano was ultimately convicted of several murders and received 8 life sentences and 3 death sentences. He was executed at a Florida state prison in 1998. In the wake of this week's announcement, Volusia County Sheriff Mike Chitwood said in part, quote, "Finally, this family can answer the question of what happened to their loved one. While this isn't the news any family hopes to hear, I'm grateful for everyone who worked so hard to make sure we found the truth and gave Pamela a proper memorial." According to reports, Pamela's sister has since collected her remains and a memorial marker has been placed where her body was recovered. That memorial reads, quote, "She had the voice of an angel." Representatives from Illinois' North Aurora Police Department released a major update in a more than 45-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that thanks to a lucky break and new DNA technology, that they had finally solved the killing of a local woman. The whole thing began on March 29, 1979, when 19-year-old Kathy Halley disappeared from her apartment complex in the small Illinois village. A search was launched, but it would come to a tragic end 3 weeks later, when Kathy's body was found in the Fox River. For 40 years, little progress was made in the investigation. That was until by chance in 2019, investigators in the nearby community of Lyle reopened another cold case, the murder of 16-year-old Pamela Moorer. DNA in that investigation led to a serial killer named Bruce Lindahl. After hearing about this and learning that Lindahl had frequented the Northgate shopping center where Kathy Halley worked at the time of her disappearance and murder, North Aurora police decided to look into him as a possible suspect in her case as well. Testing in 2020 proved to be a setback as DNA was too degraded for a clear comparison. In 2022, though, investigators got some good news when they learned that there was another box of evidence with Lindahl's belongings that they could test. This, combined with newer, much more sensitive DNA technology known as MVAC, was used to test DNA on Kathy's sweater. It turned out to be a match to the known serial killer. Unfortunately, Bruce Lindahl can no longer be held legally responsible for his crimes. Though he's believed to have killed as many as a dozen women and girls during his reign of terror, he died himself in 1981 during another violent incident. During that incident, he accidentally fatally stabbed himself while killing another man. His body was apparently found on top of the victims. Despite this, in a statement this week, North Aurora police said that if Lindahl were alive today, this case would have been strong enough to go to court. A representative said in part, quote, "His pattern of violence, combined with the DNA evidence we now have, leaves no doubt that he was responsible for Kathy's tragic death. While we cannot prosecute Lindahl, the family now knows the truth, and justice, though delayed, has finally been served for Kathy." As for Kathy's family, they say that revisiting the case, even after all this time, has been difficult, but that they are grateful to finally have answers. In their own statement, they said in part, quote, "Thanks to advancements in DNA technology and groundbreaking investigative tools, we are hopeful that other families won't have to endure the same pain and uncertainty that we faced for so many years. We extend our heartfelt thanks to the North Aurora Police Department and all the agencies and organizations involved for their dedication, persistence, and for never giving up, even when the odds seemed impossible." Authorities in Dunn County, Wisconsin released a massive update in a more than 50-year-old cold case murder investigation this week, announcing that after all this time, they have finally unmasked the person responsible. The case began all the way back on February 15, 1974, when an awful discovery was made in the town of Springbrook. Lying at the side of the road near the intersection of 408th Avenue and 990th Street, 25-year-old Mary Schley. She had suffered numerous stabbing and slashing wounds and had obviously been the victim of a vicious attack. Mary was from Minnesota and at the time of her murder was believed to be hitchhiking to an art show in Chicago. However, she had never been able to complete the trip. Upon launching an investigation, police were optimistic when they received a promising early lead from an eyewitness. The witness told detectives that they had been driving through the area where Mary was found the previous night and had spotted a man behaving strangely near the side of the road. The man took off in his vehicle as soon as he realized the witness was there. Unfortunately, despite this information, police were unable to locate the mystery man. With few other leads, the investigation petered out and the case soon went cold. It would stay that way for decades until finally authorities tried a different approach. Like so many cases in recent years, the answer lay in genetic genealogy. As it happened, Mary's killer had left one other clue behind at the 1974 crime scene, a hat with a few strands of hair inside. With the help of staff at Ramapo College in New Jersey, Dunn County investigators were able to conduct DNA analysis on the hairs. The results led back to one suspect, a now 84-year-old Minnesota man named John K. Miller. According to police, Miller was recently brought in for questioning in connection with the cold case and initially denied any involvement. However, that changed when he was presented with the DNA evidence. Miller allegedly told detectives that on that fateful night back in February of 1974, he had spotted Mary as she was walking down the side of the road. He offered her a ride and she accepted, but soon after, things took a dark turn. Miller said he began asking Mary for sex, and when she refused, he pulled out a knife and began stabbing her in the back. He admitted that he was trying to hide her body in a snowbank when the witness who had initially spoken to police drove by and startled him. Miller was arrested on murder charges on November 7th and is currently awaiting extradition to Wisconsin. Representatives from Utah's Uinta County Sheriff's Office released a massive update in a nearly 52-year-old murder and rape investigation this week, announcing that after all this time, they have now identified the second and final suspect in the case. The disturbing situation began all the way back on the evening of November 26, 1972, when 21-year-old Gregory Nickel was out for the night on a date. The young Vietnam veteran, who had just been discharged from the Army, was home for Thanksgiving to visit his family and had decided to spend some time with an 18-year-old local woman he was seeing. The pair drove out to a scenic overlook just west of the city of Vernal. They parked and were in the middle of talking when suddenly there was a knock at the driver's side window. When Gregory opened up, there was a man standing there who claimed that there had been a car accident and asked if Gregory could drive into town to get help. Gregory turned for a moment, and in that brief window, the unknown man pulled out a gun. He shot Gregory once in the head before firing at least 3 more rounds into his body. Before the 18-year-old woman could react, the attacker had pushed Gregory over on top of her and gotten into the vehicle. He proceeded to hold her at gunpoint and began driving. As soon as the man pulled out, another vehicle with a second suspect began following. The men drove the teen to a local reservoir where they horrifyingly took turns raping her while they burned Gregory's car and body. After driving her around for several more hours, they dropped the female victim off at the side of a highway and left. Though the woman was able to get help, frustratingly, she didn't have much information to give police. The attackers had placed a bag over her head for most of the assault and had referred to each other by fake nicknames, Johnny and Tex. While the case went cold, investigators had the foresight to collect swabs from the 18-year-old victim, which were saved in evidence. These swabs would eventually become crucial when DNA technology finally came around and the case was re-examined. The first major breakthrough was announced on the 50th anniversary of the murder and rape back in November of 2022. That's when police revealed the name of one of the 2 suspects, Daniel Arthur Bell. Unfortunately, Bell had died back in 2019, so he could no longer be legally held responsible for the crime. Finding the second suspect was considerably more challenging. Daniel Bell had been unmasked after a DNA match was found in a police database. However, no such match could be found to the other sample. That's when law enforcement turned to genetic genealogy. Like it has with so many cases over the past few years, the technique finally provided some much-needed answers. And so, on November 1st, 2024, police were able to reveal that they had found the second suspect. Not only that, but he was still alive. The man's name is Daryl Eugene Choate, and he was arrested at his home in Tuel, Utah. The 74-year-old is now facing a charge of first-degree felony murder. Representatives from Massachusetts' Hampton County Sheriff's Office released a massive update in a more than 45-year-old cold case double murder investigation this week, announcing that after all this time, a new tip has finally led to the arrest of the alleged killer. The case began all the way back on the morning of November 19th, 1978, when a disturbing discovery was made in the city of West Springfield. At a rest stop off of Riverdale Street, police found a green 1967 Dodge pickup truck. At first, it looked like the vehicle had been abandoned. That was until officers noticed that there was blood splattered in various places on the outside and interior. Upon further searches, another awful find was made. Over by a guardrail and concrete retaining wall, authorities found the bodies of 2 people. One was the truck's owner, 20-year-old Mark Harnish. The other was his girlfriend, 18-year-old Teresa Marcoux. Both had suffered numerous gunshot wounds that had been fired at close range. After launching an investigation, police learned that the couple were locals who had both attended Longmeadow High School. Neither had graduated, and it was believed they were living out of Mark's truck at the time. They had last been seen at a friend's party the previous night. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of investigators, the case was unable to be solved at the time. There were really only a few pieces of evidence, and most, like statements from witnesses who claimed to hear gunshots that morning, didn't point in any specific direction. The exception was a single bloody fingerprint which was found on the passenger side window of the truck. However, this also couldn't be linked to anyone at the time. The case remained cold until quite recently, when Hampton County Police received information out of the blue from an anonymous tipster. The tipster said that a friend who had since passed away revealed the identity of Mark and Teresa's killer. His name was Timothy Jolie. When authorities looked into this, things quickly started to check out. Jolie lived in the area at the time of the 1978 double murder and had purchased a gun just a month before the killings. Investigators caught another lucky break when they learned of a taxi cab license application that Jolie had filled out back in the year 2000. As part of the application, his fingerprints were taken. When they compared this to the bloody print, they were stunned. It came back as a match to Jolie's left thumb. The now 71-year-old was arrested on October 30th at his home in Clearwater, Florida. While neither Mark or Teresa's parents were alive to hear these new developments, police addressed their surviving relatives during a press conference this week. A representative stated in part, quote, "I admire and respect you for your patience, resolve, and the faith that I know you've maintained over these many years." Despite acknowledging that there was still a ways to go before justice would be served, police reminded the public that Mark and Teresa had not been forgotten. According to reports, Teresa was known as someone who loved to laugh and always had a smile on her face. At the time of her death, she was working in the pet department of a local hardware store. Mark, meanwhile, was known as a quiet but polite young man who worked at a local car repair shop. At the time of this recording, Timothy Jolie is now awaiting extradition to Massachusetts, where he will face 2 counts of murder. Representatives from California's Office of the District Attorney for Riverside County released a major update on a more than 40-year-old cold case murder this week, announcing that after all this time they had finally identified the perpetrator behind the brutal rape and killing of a local teenage girl. The case began all the way back on February 9th, 1979, when 17-year-old Esther Gonzalez left her parents' home in the city of Beaumont. She was only supposed to be traveling a few miles to visit her sister in neighboring Banning. However, she never arrived. Worried family members had barely gotten an opportunity to go out and look for Esther when the following day, Riverside County Police received a call from an unknown man. That man stated that he had found a body at the side of Highway 243, just south of Poppet Flats Road. When officers went out to investigate, they were quickly able to confirm the awful discovery. It was Esther's body, and she had been raped, bludgeoned to death, and dumped in a snowbank. Almost immediately, authorities turned their attention to the mystery caller that had first made the report about Esther's remains. The man was strangely argumentative with police on the phone and seemed to be behaving strangely. After 5 days, detectives managed to track him down, and he was identified as Louis Randolph Randy Williamson. They asked him to take a polygraph test, and he agreed, but was ruled out as a suspect after he passed. No other major leads followed, and soon the case went cold. Despite their lack of success, police continued investigating the case, periodically trying new tactics, especially with the advent of DNA technology. Semen evidence taken from Esther's body was eventually tested, and the resulting profile was entered into the CODIS database, though unfortunately no matches were found. Finally, in 2023, members of Riverside County's Regional Cold Case Homicide Team decided to partner with Othram Labs. If you're a regular viewer of the channel, you'll likely recognize that name, as they specialize in DNA and forensic genealogical testing. Othram was able to help Riverside investigators generate new leads. However, sometime during this process, it was discovered that a major oversight had been made. While their initial suspect, Randy Williamson, had been excluded by the polygraph test, he had never been ruled out with DNA. Unfortunately, Williamson had since died in Florida in 2014, but blood samples of his had been collected at that time. When this was tested recently against the 1979 cold case evidence, it was found to be a match. Of course, given that Williamson is deceased, he can no longer be held legally responsible for the crime. However, questions still remain about the circumstances behind all of this, and very little about Williamson has currently been released. It appears that authorities themselves are still looking into this, as in the press release put out this week, they asked for any members of the public with information about Williamson or Esther's case to come forward. Eerily, they also suggested that they were looking into other potential victims. Representatives from Indiana's Griffith Police Department say that a more than 40-year-old cold case murder investigation has officially come full circle this week, after they made an arrest in the killing after all this time, thanks in large part to the son of one of the original detectives who worked the case. The whole thing started back on November 3rd, 1981, when the victim, John Blaylock, was found dead inside of the bedroom of his apartment. The 51-year-old had been brutally beaten to death and was naked from the waist down. There was blood everywhere, and shards of pottery splattered with John's hair and tissue were found close to his body. At the time, authorities did their best to investigate the case. However, they didn't get very far. The best lead they uncovered was from a female witness who said she'd seen John 2 nights earlier at a local bar. He was standing with a man that was around half his age with straggly, dirty blonde hair. However, police were unable to identify him. One of those on the case at the time was Detective John Mowry Sr., who never forgot about the murder even long after it went cold. In a stroke of coincidence, it would end up being the efforts of his own son that would finally bring the answers he had been looking for. In 2018, John Mowry Jr. reopened the investigation after he had become a detective with the Griffith police himself. He began meticulously digging through the evidence and re-examining the case, a process that included interviewing his now retired father. The new investigation eventually focused on some blood samples that had been found in John Blaylock's bathroom, which had since been discovered not to belong to him. With the benefit of decades worth of new DNA techniques and technology, John Mowry Jr. and his team decided to take a contemporary approach. They reached out to a private lab that specializes in genetic genealogy. The process eventually led to 3 suspects within the same family, and it took some time to narrow things down further. However, after ruling out 2 of the 3 suspects with DNA evidence, they were finally led to their man, 64-year-old Gregory Thurston. Thurston was arrested recently at his home in Eugene, Oregon. Unfortunately, not much else has been released at this time about Thurston or the alleged circumstances or motive behind the 1981 murder, though hopefully these answers won't take anywhere near as long to find. At the time of this recording, Thurston has been extradited back to Lake County and is currently awaiting charges. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.